China will continue to increase investment in the least developed countries, aiming to increase its total to $12 billion by 2030.
China contributes the most international financial assistance of any developing country. We look at China's unique foreign aid model. Hello, I'm Nathan King in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. At a time when Western countries contract and shrink foreign aid funding, China expands its foreign assistance. It's the developing country that gives the most, and from 2010 to 2012, China provided foreign aid to 121 countries. China's foreign aid model focuses on South-South cooperation, or countries in the global south, providing funds to other developing countries. China also focuses on bilateral aid and infrastructure investment, as seen in its Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
China will establish an assistance fund for South-South cooperation with an initial pledge of $2 billion in support of developing countries' implementation of the post-2015 development agenda.
As the international community focuses on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, China is committing itself to sustainable development internationally through investment. While China's foreign financial assistance crosses the globe, almost half of it ends up in African countries.
No matter how rapidly the international and regional landscapes change, African countries have remained the most faithful brothers of China, and China has been and remains one of Africa's most reliable partners. In recent years, we have held fast to solutions with Chinese characteristics and actively participated in Africa's peace and stability, gaining recognition and appreciation.
To explore China's foreign aid model in Africa, we are joined from Beijing by He Wenping, Director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. From the United Nations in New York, Ayodele Odosula, he is the Chief Economist for the United Nations Development Programme for Africa. And with me in the studio is Deborah Broadegum. She is the Director of the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. Let's go to Beijing first. He Wenping, China obviously growing in its aid overseas, especially in Africa. Nearly a majority of countries it gives to on the African continent. What are they contributing and why?
Well, yes, China has increased our development assistance to Africa year by year. Especially, everybody knows, last December, during the Chinese-African Johannesburg Summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping has made another new pledge as high as $60 billion. So among those 60 billion, I think also there are quite a lot of part will be the development assistance, that is the aid. The reason China has paid great attention to Africa, I think there are simply two reasons. Number one is Africa is the continent that badly need development assistance to catch up with other continents in this global village. Because I think as many as 36, those least developed countries, among those 49 in whole of the world now are still African countries. So they need help. And the second reason is that China has a long tradition to providing aid to Africa. Ever since the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949. So the following year, China has provided aid to Western African countries in agricultural development, and also later on, those development assistance has been goes to the industrialization and also to medical care, help, so and also education. So we have long history, and China also enjoyed we call all-weather friendship with Africa.
Right, thank you very much. I want to bring in Deborah here in the studio. He's right about China giving, basically since the founding of modern China, Bandung Conference, non-aligned movement, all that sort of stuff. But things have changed recently, and China's model of giving aid is very different from former colonial powers in the West, right?
That depends, actually. China's, Dr. Hu Wenping mentioned, for example, this pledge of $60 billion. And I think it's important to disaggregate that into what is actually official development assistance and what is commercial instruments. And out of that $60 billion, really only $5 billion is traditional development assistance, grants and loans only coming in for development projects. The other $55 billion is much more commercial. It's investment funds in which Chinese companies will be encouraged to invest in industry and other sectors. And it's also commercial loans and preferential export credits. And these are all about business. And so in that sense, China's engagement in Africa is actually similar to European countries' engagement at an earlier period, which was a lot about driving business relationships and tying aid to companies coming from China as they were coming from Europe for the Europeans in the earlier period.
In New York, is Deborah right that a lot of this aid and, of course, investment, the two sometimes go hand in hand, is a Chinese model? There's a lot of emphasis on long-term loans, capacity building, infrastructure development, agricultural development, sometimes for profit, and then also sometimes, obviously, through aid mechanisms as well. Does that work well hand in hand?
All right. The Chinese aid to Africa is essentially focusing on the area of capacity development and infrastructure, and particularly almost about 51.8% of it on infrastructure. It's really a good idea because by the time we realize that the role of infrastructure in facilitating rapid economic growth and poverty reduction is very critical, we then know that spending such proportion of the aid in the area of infrastructure is in the right direction. One of the studies that is going on in the continent shows that if you increase access to electricity, for instance, by 1%, it reduces poverty by 0.62%. This is more or less a kind of action in the right direction. But again, we're not yet there. We need to really make sure it really manifests into a win-win development partnership and strategy in Africa.
Is that happening, do you believe?
Well, I think for it to happen, we need to really do a few things. One, the African government needs to have a strategic engagement approach that really helps to really direct investment or aid towards the national development priorities. And at the same time, they really need to put in place some kind of strategy that really diversify some of the Chinese engagement away from the extractive sector into the other sectors of the economy that drive economic growth and development simultaneously.
Dr. He Wenping in Beijing, of course, China is the biggest contributor in aid of developing countries. It's worth noting China is still a developing country in some sense. Does the China development model, is that exportable, considering China's rapid rise?
China's development model, I think, is still in the process of development by ourselves. China's model, there are many different kind of explanations. For example, I think, to my understanding, the key element is to have a gradual reform, like to the try and error. So for Africa, recent years I traveled to many African countries. Yes, the fact is there is an increasing understanding that is called looking east policy, to see why the China and other emerging countries in the Asian countries, they can develop so fast during such a short time. So they want to take those references of China's model, such as to develop those economic and trade industrial zone, and also how to develop infrastructure first to lay the foundation for the economic takeoff, and also like how to develop the township industry and to make the education like a training center. So all of that. So this is a very natural process because there is some commonality between China and Africa. When both make their economic takeoff, in China, it's back to like 1970. Now in Africa, I think they have been done that reform also for quite a long time.
Deborah, I want to bring you in here. The flip side of that, some criticism is that China sometimes uses Africa for excess capacity in its own economy, that sometimes it's been exploitative, some Western powers too. What's your reaction to that?
I think there is a lot of complementarity between what African countries need and what China has to offer. And in terms of overcapacity, African countries are in huge need of infrastructure, and this is an area in overcapacity. If you think of concrete, steel, and then construction activities in China, these are cutting back after the stimulus of the last few decades. And so these companies are trying to get work abroad. And in Africa, Chinese construction companies are taking in revenues of about $50 billion a year. So this is a huge business market for them. And this is all to the good for African countries because they need that electricity, they need those roads, they need those hydropower plants. On the other hand, it's controversial as well. By my estimates and our estimates at the China-Africa Research Initiative, there is more construction activity going on than there is extractive activity going on.
So more building roads and railways rather than mining,
in terms of the value, I think it's pretty clear. So there is mining investment, quite a bit of it. There is petroleum investment, but there hasn't been as much results from the petroleum investment. China does import a lot from Africa, but a lot of that is produced by non-Chinese companies, including African companies themselves. So the big area of business is really the construction industry.
Yeah, really interesting going forward. In terms of aid, Ayodeji, in terms of aid to Africans who need it most, where are the Chinese priorities? Obviously, we've been talking about investments in infrastructure and transport and mining, but in terms of aid, where is it? Agriculture, capacity building for smaller communities?
Thank you very much. I think when it comes to the issue of investment in Africa, we have to focus on those areas that will help the African government to really implement their structural economic transformation, which they have all agreed to do. The first thing is we have to focus attention on increasing the agricultural productivity because that is where majority of the poor people in Africa live. Once we are able to enhance the income coming from that particular sector and the productivity, definitely we'll be able to dent inequality, poverty to a large extent. And again, we have to develop a kind of vocational skill. I know China has been focusing attention on that, but we need more effort in developing what we call the skill content of the youths so that they will be able to really transform the manufacturing sector as more or less moving away from the traditional sector into modern sector in a way that will generate employment, then that will deepen technology transfer, which we have not really seen for quite a while. Essentially, in the area of construction, which Chinese is really doing, some of the feedback we are getting from countries shows that there seems to be some kind of crowding out effect, meaning that some of the jobs that can be done by the nationals that are being done by the companies, Chinese, which they think is really edging them out of their skill and their jobs. This is an area which I think we need to really look into in making sure that it's a win-win situation whereby it enhances the absorption of the excess capacity in China, but also in generating decent jobs and employment opportunities for the African youths.
Yeah, a balance is needed. Ayodeji Edesula, thank you so much for joining us from New York, and Deborah also here in the studio. We are going to take a break, but coming up, we look beyond Africa and explore China's South-South cooperation model. How does it help countries in Latin America and Asia and beyond? Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about China's foreign assistance model. The cornerstone is China's South-South cooperation, providing aid to other developing countries to contribute to global growth. Still with me from Beijing is He Wenping, Director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And joining us for this part of the show from the United Nations is Jorge Chediek. He is the Director of the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation. And from Geneva, Martin Kaur is the Executive Director of the South Centre. Thanks so much for joining us all. Let's start with Beijing. He Wenping, back in 2015, President Xi Jinping of China announced to the UN General Assembly a $2 billion contribution to this South-South mechanism. First of all, what is it and how's it going to be spent?
This pledge has proved that the Chinese government has attached great attention to this South-South cooperation. Even half a year ago, I joined a launching ceremony in the Chinese Academy of Foreign Studies. They have established the SouthSouth Research Center. So this also offered as a think tank for this South-South cooperation career. So I think the reason that China attached such a great attention to South-South cooperation is simply because China itself is the biggest developing country. It's a South country, even though now we have becoming the second biggest economy in the world, but by per capita GDP, China is still ranks, I think is very low in all of the country list. So we are the South country, that's for sure, but we have achieved a lot for this general GDP development. So we have lots of experience can be shared with other developing South countries. So those experience, I think, is quite rich and also quite relevant. And now with this new initiative called One Belt, One Road, now Chinese government want to put those a lot of thoughts into action. That is going to build those infrastructure, all the connectivity, all the way around those Belt Road countries to share our development experience, and also those capital accumulation has been gained from those past 30 years reform and opening up.
Martin Kaur in Geneva, I want to come to you next because you've said China's South-South Fund is a game changer globally. What do you mean by that?
Well, we have two types of South-South cooperation, really. One is North-South cooperation, by which we mean the developed countries that had pledged to give 0.7% of their GNP to developing countries, mainly because they are richer, they have more money, and secondly, because of the colonial experience. They recognize that developing countries were colonies and they have to be helped out in their independence period. So it's a kind of obligation by the rich countries to help the poor countries. Now, the other type of cooperation is South-South cooperation. And this is where the role of China comes in. South-South cooperation is not based on obligation, but it is based on solidarity between developing countries and mutual respect and also mutual benefit. It's not that I have to help you, but that I want to help you in order to express my solidarity. So when President Xi Jinping in United States last year announced the two funds, by the way, one is the development fund of $2 billion, the other is the climate fund, South-South Climate Fund of $3.1 billion. These are very big amounts compared to a few million or hundreds of millions.
So why are they a game changer?
Setting up two institutions. It's a game changer, one, because a country like China is setting up two new institutions, two new funds. And secondly, to be very frank, the quantity is large. This is not just a $30 million fund. These are huge quantities, which in a way rival the developed countries. Even though China is not obliged to do it, China is going to give funds equivalent to what the United States or Europe or something are giving to the developing countries. So it is a game changer in that South-South cooperation can now complement, which is what we are saying. It should not replace, it should complement. But in the case of China, it could even match what the developed countries are providing to developing countries.
Jorge of the United Nations, obviously you live and breathe the South-South agenda. Just address what we've just heard. Is it China's massive financial contribution over the last few years that is helping South-South integration, or is it Chinese development model as well, considering, of course, it still is a developing country when you consider a gross national product per person?
Yes, following up on what Mr. Kaur was saying, I agree that the Chinese engagement in South-South cooperation is a game changer. As you said, as you implied in your question, one key element is the model, the Chinese model that has shown that there is an alternative way to develop based on a different interpretation of structural economics that has yielded spectacular results. In addition, we can show that some of the specific sectoral policies are also very valuable in themselves. And thirdly, the new element is the one that was being highlighted in the previous conversation, the importance of the significant commitment of resources that China is making. So therefore, China is making South-South cooperation a reality as a very important instrument to build a better world, a more interdependent world, a world in which southern countries can promote their common interests with the support of examples and resources.
He Wenping, in Beijing, there has been some criticism of Chinese aid and also investment in the South, that it hasn't cured or helped alleviate things like corruption and improve local governance. Is Beijing mindful of that as it continues to develop its aid policies?
Well, yes, I think China's help, like China's development assistance, goes to lots of countries, Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asian countries, so many. Yes, I have heard some criticism goes to China's aid modality, and even some criticism saying this is not good for improving like democracy or human rights in some recipient countries. But I think facts speaks louder than those voices. So if we go to those recipient countries, you will see I don't think those development aids from China now has blocked or hindered those recipient countries' governance. Actually, it's helped a lot for their economic development. Economic development actually can serve as a very strong basis for their democracy. So without good economic performance, those democratic development itself cannot hold water at all. So you can see many countries, particularly in Africa, so when they have election, pre-election, during the election, even after election, some of them often goes with hand in hand with chaos. So a lot of fighting. Why is that? Because those limited resources, those very poor economic development somehow has hindered those democratic development. So I don't see any conflict between China's development assistance with Western countries' development assistance to some certain same recipient countries. Actually, it can play, hand in hand and complemented with each other.
Jorge, do you want to pick up on that point? Because obviously we've seen Chinese assistance to lots of countries in Latin America, about over 20 or so. But we have seen political instability in Venezuela recently, and also regional superpower Brazil. Can foreign assistance and investment bring political stability? But this is also a domestic concern as well, right?
Development is an integral process, so you need to take care of all the dimensions: the economic infrastructure, the social development, the political maturity of the society. So all of them have to be taken into consideration. And different ways of international collaboration can address the different aspects of this whole development dimension. In the context of the Chinese collaboration with Latin America, it has really been a game changer. Trade between Latin America and China grew by almost a factor of 25 between the beginning of this century and 2015. China has become the largest market for South American products as of last year. And in addition, massive Chinese investment, supported in many cases with the funding from public banks, has really helped change the economic infrastructure of Latin America. So it is an extremely valuable contribution. In addition, in the case of Latin America, we have to point out that one of the main problems of Latin America is not necessarily extreme poverty, although we have a lot of poverty there, but the problem that is worse in the region is inequality. The fact that the gap between the richest and the poorest is the widest in the world. So achieving development that generates employment and generates more opportunity for the poor is key for the stability and the sustainability of Latin American societies.
Martin, I want to bring you here in Geneva, because obviously China's giving but also investment is probably the biggest, closest to home in Asia. Obviously, we've seen a lot of investment with the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and also the One Belt, One Road initiative. How is that helping development of Asia, especially Southeast Asia as well?
Well, I think financing of infrastructure and financing of manufacturing jobs, financing of agriculture is very critical to development, and the South-South cooperation in terms of trade, that is buying products from others, in terms of investing in new projects, which is now happening in many parts of Asia from China, and also the promotion of infrastructure development, not only through the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, but also through the One Belt, One Road program, which has got many countries very excited. These things are generating investment and development and growth in many Asian, but not only Asia, but in many developing countries. So the South-South cooperation policy of China has many facets, and each of them are important. I think one facet is aid, which we have discussed, but even then, we are still at the beginning stage of the aid explosion coming from China. What kind of institutions is China going to establish in order to be able to channel all these funds? The second is China's own policy example. And I think in climate change, China is showing a very good example through its national policies of trying to put a maximum level to its own emissions by the year 2030, to reduce emissions content of GNP by 60%, and by having a target of 20% of non-fossil fuels in their energy mix by 2030. So these are examples which, through its own experiments that China is making, will have lessons for developing countries. And then we have trade. Commodity purchase by China has become very important for developing countries. The question is whether, as commodities decline in terms of quantity, because we are running out of raw materials, whether we can have a decent price for these commodities so that there will be good terms of trade for other developing countries. We have the RCEP in Asia, that's a regional comprehensive economic partnership
trade deals,
agreement that is supposed to unlock trade between Asian countries. We have the infrastructure and financing of infrastructure. These are new institutions created by China and new projects. So overall, there is, you might say, as a package, there is really a massive development of South-South cooperation, which is being generated from Beijing.
Martin Kor, big challenges ahead. Thank you so much for joining us from Geneva, and Jorge Chediek as well from the United Nations, and of course He Wenping as well from Beijing. That's all we have time for, but the conversation does continue online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CCTV_America. We also use Facebook. Find us at facebook.com/CCTV America. I'm Nathan King, Washington DC, and thanks so much for being with us.